I went back because they were finally tearing it down. That was the plain reason. The softer reason was that my mother asked me to help clear out what was left of her classroom before the district locked the building for good. And I had reached that age where you begin to understand that certain requests from your parents are not really about labor. They're about witness. She had taught at that school for almost 30 years. I had attended it long before that, from first grade through 8th. The place had held most of her working life and the whole unsettled geography of my childhood. When she said, "I don't want strangers deciding what matters in there," I knew what she meant. So I drove back to South Louisiana in late June, when the air was already thick by breakfast and the ditches were green with summer growth, and the school was sitting in that strange, half-finished state-old building center once everyone has agreed they are no longer part of the future. By then, I was living in North Carolina and working mostly on educational books, teacher guides, and little contract editing jobs that came in batches and deadlines rather than office hours. It was quiet work. I liked it. A lot of my days were spent with chapter headings, commas, lesson plans, and indexes. There is a calm in that kind of labor if your mind is built for it. Mine is. I had not lived in Louisiana for years, but I still carried it in the senses people keep longest. The smell of wet cypress mulch after rain. The slow, syrupy hum of ceiling fans in parish buildings. The particular color of afternoon sunlight on concrete after a storm. The sound of insects beginning all at once near dark. My school sat outside a small town in Terrebonne Parish, not far from a bayou road that curved past cane fields, bait shops, and low houses on blocks. It was called Belle Terre Elementary and Middle, though nobody ever used the full name. To parents, it was Belle Terre. To children, it was just the school. When I was young, I thought it was enormous. Seen as an adult, it was long and low and practical, the way many public schools are in places where weather and budgets have been negotiating for decades. The oldest wing was brick. The newer parts were pale block with metal awnings and windows set high enough to discourage distraction. There was a front office, a cafeteria, a library, a gym with a stage at one end, and, farther back near the tree line, 2 portable classrooms that had outlasted every temporary promise made about replacing them. The playground sat on blacktop, too hot for bare hands by noon. Behind it ran a drainage ditch lined with grass that grew thick and bright after rain. Live oaks leaned near the parking lot, always dropping leaves into the same corners, no matter how often they were swept. In summer, the whole campus smelled faintly of bleach, damp paper, floor wax, and heat. That smell hit me first when I went back. Not memory in the abstract. Memory as an immediate physical fact. My mother had a ring of classroom keys in her hand, and the front office was dark, and the district had already pulled most of the bulletin boards down, leaving pale rectangles on the walls where sun had not touched in years. The fluorescent lights came on in groups rather than all at once. Somewhere far down the 6th grade hall, a door was propped open and tapping gently with the air from a vent. "It looks smaller," I said. My mother smiled in the tired way teachers do when they have heard some version of that sentence from former students all their lives. "It was always small," she said. "You were the one who was little." That was true. She had taught 4th grade in the last years before retiring, and her room was near the library, on the quieter side of campus, where the floor still held traces of old terrazzo under newer sealant. We spent the first afternoon doing exactly what we had come to do, sorting workbooks, packing framed drawings, deciding which sets of battered class novels were worth donating, and which had finally reached the honest end of their lives. There is a peace in that kind of work, too. You make stacks, you fill boxes, you read names on old labels, you find dried glue sticks Outdated maps, report card copies, paper clips gone rusty in the damp. The past in schools is never buried. It accumulates in cabinets. I was staying with my aunt in town, and for that first week I fell into a very simple routine. I would wake early because Louisiana mornings make it impossible not to wake early. I'd drink coffee in my aunt's kitchen while the local news mumbled about heat advisories and drainage projects. Then I'd drive out to the school with my mother or meet her there, and we'd spend the morning clearing one room or shelf or cupboard at a time. Around noon, when the heat got heavy enough to flatten thought, we would take lunch from the gas station on the highway or from a plate lunch place near the parish offices. Then back to the building for a few more hours until the day became all glare and fatigue. In the evenings, I'd sit on my aunt's back porch and listen to tree frogs begin and think about how easy it is for a place to return to you once your body relearns the weather. The school's farewell open house was still a week away, and the principal, new enough that she had not known me as a child, had asked if I would write a short piece for the alumni memory booklet they were putting together. A page or two. Something warm. Something about what the school had meant. I told her I would. At the time, I imagined I would write the kind of thing people usually write for that sort of booklet. The smell of cafeteria rolls, field day, reading under the big oak tree. The way teachers in small towns know your whole family before you know your own mind. That sort of clean nostalgia. What I had forgotten, or perhaps never fully admitted, was that most of my strongest memories of Belterre were not clean at all. They were quiet, strange, and difficult to place even now. These are the stories I kept not writing down. The first one came back to me on the second day. My mother had gone home early to rest her knees, and I stayed behind because she had asked me to sort a cabinet of old reading folders in the library workroom. The library had always been my favorite place in the building. Even as a child, I preferred its older air and the hush of it. It was small by any grand standard, with low shelves, faded posters about summer reading, and a circulation desk that seemed taller when I was 8 than the principal's office did at 12. In June, with the school empty, it felt oddly tender. The carpet had been lifted in strips near the back wall because of old moisture damage, and the bare concrete showed darker there. The computers were gone. The blinds were half drawn against the heat. On one cart, I found a stack of laminated reading group signs in my mother's handwriting from years I had probably still lived at home. I was kneeling by a cabinet when I heard children reading aloud. Not loudly. Not as if a class were in session. More like a low, blended recitation from a room farther down the hall. I couldn't make out individual words at first, only that distinct school sound of many small voices trying to stay together while not all moving at the same speed. I sat back on my heels and listened. The sound came again, a rise and fall, then silence. Now, an empty school in summer is full of noises, vents, pipes, birds in the eaves, the strange elastic creak of buildings cooling and warming as clouds move over them. I knew that even then. I am not the sort of person who hears one unexplained sound and declares a haunting. Still, the cadence of it was so specific that I stood and went to the library door. The fourth grade rooms were across from the library, and beyond them, the old resource room sat where it always had. Door shut, narrow window dark. The hall smelled of wax and dust. Nothing moved. I could hear only the air conditioning struggling somewhere in the office wing. I stood there long enough to feel a little silly. Then, just as I was turning back inside, I heard it once more. Children reading together, soft and level, from the direction of the resource room. That was when the first old fear came back whole. When I was in 4th grade, the resource room had been used only irregularly. Some years it held intervention groups. Some years, it became overflow storage for paper and textbooks. During my year, Mrs. Lorio, who ran reading support, got sick halfway through spring term and never came back before summer. No one told us much because we were children, and because adults in schools often think vagueness is a form of kindness. After that, the room stayed mostly shut. One rainy afternoon, my mother had kept me late because she was still at a conference with parents, and there had been too much thunder for me to walk to the pickup line alone. I was 9 and bored and wandering. She told me to take a stack of duplicate worksheets from her room to the library workroom because she needed the space. I remember the hall that day clearly. Damp windows, rainwater tracked in by small shoes, the smell of wet paper and old pencil wood. As I crossed past the resource room, I heard children reading behind the closed door. Not talking. Reading. Exactly the same low togetherness I heard as an adult in the library hall all those years later. I stopped because I knew nobody was meant to be in there. The room had been dark all week. The little schedule card on the outside still held Mrs. Lorio's name written in curling blue marker from before Easter. There was a narrow, wired glass window in the door. I stepped up on the metal threshold strip and looked through. To this day, I cannot tell you what I saw with any perfect confidence. It looked at first glance like a class seated at the small tables, heads bent, reading folders propped open, one child near the back with a red ribbon in her hair. The room was dim, not fully lit, the way classrooms sometimes are when the overheads are off, but the stormlight is bright through the blinds. Then the reading stopped all at once. The figures, or what I had taken for figures, did not lift their heads. They simply ceased to be readable as children. What remained, when I looked harder, was a room full of stacked chairs and piles of books, arranged in shapes my mind had accepted too quickly as seated people. I stood there for a few more seconds and started to feel embarrassed with myself. Then the desk chair beside the teacher's table began to rock gently back and forth. I ran to my mother's room so fast I dropped half the worksheets. She told me I'd frightened myself on shadows, and maybe I had. Children are generous with fear. We turn rooms into intentions because we have too little power inside them. But later that evening, when she locked up, she found the resource room door standing ajar. I did not tell anyone else for years. Standing in that same hall as an adult, with the old summer air pressing at the windows and the library cart at my back, I thought of that chair rocking, and of how convinced I had been that I was foolish. The reading sound did not come again that day, but it came the next. By then I had started paying closer attention to the building itself, not out of panic, out of that slower curiosity adults sometimes inherit from children after enough time has made them brave. Belterre had changed over the years, but not evenly. The older hall still had the same bulletin board frames and the same shallow drinking fountains where the push buttons stuck in damp weather. The gym smelled the same too. Varnish, dust, old ropes, and that faint sourness from generations of uniforms dried badly in lockers. The stage curtains were newer, but the wooden backstage stairs still gave the same dry complaint under weight. My routine deepened. Mornings with my mother, afternoons alone if she left early. I began opening rooms I had not entered since adolescence just to see how small they had become. The science room, with its chipped lab tables, the art cupboard where clay once dried on newspaper, the music room where we learned recorder badly and with confidence. And then there was the gym. If the library held my gentler memories, the gym held my longest unease. On the third afternoon of that week, I was helping move old trophy cases away from the wall, so a district maintenance crew could measure for removal. The gym doors were propped open because of the heat, and summer light was coming in flat and white across the court. Without students, a school gym becomes all echo and scale. Every step you take sounds like someone walking a little behind you. I had just slid one of the smaller cases aside when I heard the squeak of trainers on varnished floor. A single quick slide, then another. I looked up at once. No one. The court was empty. The bleachers retracted. The stage curtain half tied back for the crew. Beyond the open side doors, I could see the blacktop and the bright line of the drainage ditch grass. Then, in the reflection of the glass case I was gripping, I saw movement cross the far end of the gym. Not on the floor itself. In the reflection, a line of children, 5 or 6 of them, moving single file toward the side exit that used to lead to the portable classrooms. I turned around immediately. Nothing. Only the polished floor, the painted key, the folded basketball goals high above, and the late afternoon heat standing in the doorway. That was enough to bring back the second story. When I was 11, I played on the school basketball team, with all the grace of a child who mostly preferred books, but still wanted to belong to something with a uniform. Practice ran late twice a week in winter. The sky would already be dark when we came out, and the parking lot lights would hum, and our parents' cars would queue by the curb one by one while the coach locked the equipment room. One evening after practice, my father was late. That in itself was not unusual. He worked on boats then, and was always either early by habit or late by necessity. So I sat on the low brick wall outside the gym and bounced my water bottle between my knees while the other boys were collected. The air smelled like river mud and diesel from the highway. Somewhere beyond the campus, someone was burning leaves. When the last other child left, Coach Landry told me to stay where the office lights were and went back inside to check the showers. I remember being proud of myself for not being childish about the dark. Then I saw the line. On the far side of the gym windows, moving along the inside edge of the court, were 6 children in single file, small, silent, headed toward the side door that led, at that time, to the portable classrooms used by first grade. I assumed they were younger children from aftercare. What unsettled me was not their presence, it was their pace. They moved with school day neatness, hands by their sides, not talking, as if following a teacher I could not see. I stood up from the wall and pressed closer to the glass. The side door opened inward. The line reached it, and then, instead of emerging into the lit path toward the portables, the children seemed simply to continue beyond the door, into darkness. Coach Landry came back out a moment later and found me at the glass. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The kids," I said. He looked through the window, then at me. "There aren't any kids." I turned back. The court was empty. He told me I was overtired. When my father arrived, I said nothing, mostly because I had already started to feel the shame children feel when the adults around them do not confirm what they saw. The next week, I learned the portable classrooms had been closed for repairs for nearly a month. That story circulated among my classmates afterward in 3 or 4 versions. In one, the children were wearing old uniforms from before the district changed colors. In another, they were carrying milk cartons. In another, they were not children at all, but pale trash bags blown across the far hall by the doors. I accepted all of those explanations at different times, because childhood is full of trial arrangements between fear and embarrassment. But standing in the gym as an adult, watching the reflected line vanish when I turned, I remembered exactly how straight they had walked. I did not tell my mother about that one either. Instead, I finished moving the trophy case, wrote down a few measurements for the maintenance crew, and went home to my aunt's porch, where the evening insects had already begun. The parish sky glowed purple over the low fields. Someone 2 houses over was boiling crabs. My aunt asked how the school looked, I said, smaller and louder than I expected. That night, I started a list in a notebook. Not a dramatic thing, just headings. The reading room, the gym line, the stage. I had not thought of the stage story in years, but by writing the first two down, I made room for the third. That one was the worst at the time, though perhaps not because it was objectively stranger. It came at an age when all fear is doubled by the fear of being ridiculous, and that makes memory cling harder. In 8th grade, I was on the committee for our spring program. I used the word committee generously. In truth, it meant I could letter reasonably neatly on poster board and was trusted not to throw decorations. The program was held in the gym because every school event was held in the gym if it needed chairs and public optimism. Graduation, Christmas songs, awards day, talent shows, blood drives, all of it. The stage at the far end always bothered me a little. It was too shallow for real theater and too high to feel safe when you stood at the front edge. Behind it was a narrow storage space full of risers, broken music stands, and costumes no one quite admitted to owning. The curtains smelled of dust and old heat, and when the gym lights were off, the first 2 rows of the audience disappeared into a dark that felt larger than the room deserved. On the evening before the program, 3 of us stayed late to stack chairs and leave name cards on the reserved front row. Our teacher sponsor, Mrs. Broussard, was in the office printing the program sheets. It had rained earlier, and the whole building had that damp, electrically tired feel schools get after storms. I was on stage taping down an extension cord when I heard applause. Not full applause, not a crowd. More like a few polite hands, the kind you hear at the end of a child's piano recital before everyone commits to enthusiasm. I looked out. My 2 classmates were still setting name cards on chairs. Neither was clapping. "Did y'all hear that?" I asked. One of them, Jamie, looked up and said, "Hear what?" Then it came again, from the dark front rows. 3 or 4 small claps. Then silence. Jamie laughed because boys of that age will laugh at anything that briefly unsettles them. The other girl, Denise, did not laugh. She was staring at the audience with the fixed concentration of someone trying not to overreact in front of witnesses. Mrs. Broussard came back in carrying program sheets and asked why we had all stopped moving. No one answered immediately. Then, from the far left front row, in a voice so soft it might have been mistaken for the air conditioner, someone said, "Start again." Mrs. Broussard set the programs down very carefully. She looked toward the front rows, then up at us, then said, "Jamie, turn the main lights on all the way." He did. The whole gym flooded bright. Nothing there. Just chairs, programs, the scuffed floor, our own faces suddenly foolish in full fluorescent light. Mrs. Broussard sent us all home 5 minutes later with the explanation that the storm had made the sound carry strangely from outside. This was not a good explanation, but it was a usable one, and that is often enough in a school. What I remember most from that night is not the voice itself. It is Denise refusing to cross in front of the first row of chairs when we left. She took the long way around the back in silence, as if not wanting to interrupt whoever might still have been sitting there after the lights came up. So those were the stories that had slept in me. The reading room, the gym line, the stage. There were smaller ones too, the sort every childhood school seems to produce. A boy who said the old nurse's office sink sometimes ran cold water by itself in August. A 5th grade rumor about names written under the bleachers. The music teacher who never left her metronome uncovered overnight. But those 3 stayed. They had shape. They had weather around them. They belonged to the school rather than just to children. As the week went on, the building started giving them back in pieces. On Thursday, while helping the office clerk box up old attendance ledgers, I smelled damp chalk and paste in the hall outside the resource room, a smell I had not encountered since the 90s. On Friday, at lunch, I saw from the library window what looked like children crossing the blacktop toward the portable slab that no longer existed. I went outside. There was only light on heat haze. That afternoon, while stacking framed class portraits in the gym office, I heard one clear clap from the dark end of the stage and did not bother checking until I had finished what was in my hands. That was new in me, too. As a child, I had feared the school because it began to simply still performing parts of its old day after the children had gone. That may sound less scary, but it was what unsettled me most. We talk about schools as institutions of instruction, discipline, and community, which they are, but they are also machines for repetition. Bells, lines, recitations, names called, chairs scraped, lunch trays, applause, dismissal, pickup, waiting, relief when someone finally arrives, shame if they do not. Childhood is made of repeated small submissions to time, and schools hold more of that than churches do. By the weekend, I had all but given up on writing a clean, nostalgic piece for the memory booklet. Instead, I started spending my lunch breaks walking the halls alone, as if a full circuit might teach me what the school had become when nobody needed lessons from it anymore. The principal found me once standing outside my old fourth-grade room. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, "just remembering." She smiled. "Everybody's been doing that." "Do people tell you strange stories about this place?" That made her laugh, but gently. "They tell me all kinds of stories, mostly about cafeteria rolls and getting paddled." "That's not what I mean." She leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and thought a second. "Old schools collect sound," she said. "That's what my grandmother always claimed. She taught for 40 years. Said children leave more noise behind than adults know what to do with." Did she mean ghosts? She meant schools are full of unfinished moments. That was as close as I got to an explanation from anyone in authority. Saturday was the farewell open house. Former students came through in waves, most of them cheerful, slightly louder than they needed to be, touching walls and pointing out where their class photos used to hang. Teachers who had retired years earlier hugged one another in the library. The cheerleaders from the early 2000s took pictures in the gym. Somebody brought a table of old yearbooks and class composite photos. The cafeteria ladies did sheet cake. A local reporter came for 30 minutes and asked the principal what the school had meant to the community in a tone that suggested he needed the answer to fit within a 90-second segment. I was meant to help direct people to the memory displays and answer questions about archived materials. Mostly, though, I watched. Schools are at their strangest during reunions because time stops respecting the walls. A woman in her 60s laughs like a fifth grader, and suddenly the corridor belongs to two eras at once. A former coach stands in the doorway and still blocks half the light. People call teachers Miss and Coach long after both parties have grandchildren. By late afternoon, heat and nostalgia had worn everyone out. The open house thinned. The principal went home. My mother had already left. A storm was building in the west. Not a bad one, but enough to give the sky that old Louisiana heaviness I had grown up mistrusting. I volunteered to stay a little later and help the custodian make sure nothing was left unsecured. He was younger than me and did not know any of the teachers I had grown up with. He checked the cafeteria and the office while I made one last pass through the library and the classroom wing. That was when the school felt fullest. Not visibly. Not in any way you could report. But the atmosphere of it changed once the open house had emptied and the storm darkened the windows. It was no longer an abandoned building. It was not quite a public event space either. It was for perhaps 20 minutes, exactly what it had been all through my childhood, a school between dismissal and weather. I walked the familiar route without hurrying. Library, fourth grade hall, water fountain corner, long turn past the old resource room, then through the side doors toward the gym. And as I walked, the sounds came back in order. First, children reading together from behind the closed room. Then, farther down, the quick soft squeak of shoes on varnish. Then the dull shifting murmur of chairs being handled on stage. I did not stop. That is important to me now. Not because I was brave, because I had reached the point where stopping seemed less respectful than continuing. The building was not asking me to solve it. It was only becoming itself in the weather. I went into the gym. The overheads were off except for the sidework lights, so the stage sat in half shadow. Outside, thunder moved somewhere over the marsh, and the windows flashed now and then with far lightning. I stood on the court, where the key line met the center stripe. Then, very quietly, from the front rows, I heard applause. Not loud, not mocking, just a few patient claps, as if for a child walking on stage and forgetting where to stand. The sound faded. After that came something I had not expected, the rattle of lunch trays, very faint, from the direction of the cafeteria wing. That one almost undid me, because it was so ordinary. There is a specific metal and plastic music to school lunch. Stacked trays, serving spoons, children sitting too quickly, chairs pulled wrong over tile. I had not thought about that sound in years. Yet hearing it there, folded into all the others, I suddenly understood that what the school held was not only fear. It held repetition itself. Every small daily ceremony children pass through without realizing how deeply it enters them. The rain started at last, hard and straight. The gym windows blurred white. And for one brief moment, in the reflective dark of the stage curtain, I thought I saw the front rows full. Not with anything theatrical. Just children sitting as children sit in schools, knees together, hands in laps, waiting for the next instruction. Some attentive, some already elsewhere, all of them held by the idea that someone would eventually call their name or tell them it was time to go. Then lightning flashed again, and the rows were empty. That was the controlled climax of it, if you need one. No running, no screaming, no figure approaching down a hall. Only a full recognition, late and calm, that the scariest thing about that school had never been death or threat, or any great supernatural intention. It was that the place had kept the shape of childhood after childhood moved on. And childhood, looked at directly, is often eerie. Because children live by borrowed structure. They wait to be told when to line up, when to sit, when to eat, when to speak, when to be collected. A school full of those repetitions after dark is bound to feel haunted, even if no one ever dies there. Perhaps especially then. I stood in the gym until the rain softened. Then I turned off the work lights, checked the side doors, and walked back to the front office where the custodian was waiting with his keys. "You all good?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I think so." That night, back at my aunt's, I sat with a memory booklet form on the kitchen table and wrote a much shorter piece than the principal had asked for. I wrote about the oak trees. I wrote about reading contests and teachers who stayed later than anyone knew. I wrote about the smell of rain on the blacktop before recess was called inside. I wrote that Belle Terre had taught generations of children more than arithmetic and grammar. It had taught us how to belong to a place small enough to remember us. All of that was true. I did not write the scary stories. I did not write about the reading room, or the gym line, or the applause from the front rows. Some memories do not belong in commemorative booklets, not because they are shameful, because they require a slower hearing than public nostalgia allows. The school was demolished 2 months later. Not all at once. First the portables, then the older wing, then the gym. The district built the new school on higher ground nearer the highway, with better drainage, brighter classrooms, and none of the old damp corners where a child's mind might arrange stacked chairs into patient readers. My mother approved of the new building in every practical way. More secure, better light, no mold in the back hall, a sensible place to teach. I approve of it too. And still, when I drive through South Louisiana in summer and see one of those low old campuses sitting under live oaks with stormlight in the windows, I feel the old recognition. Not fear, exactly. More like respect. Because I know now that what frightened me as a child at Belterre was not some single presence hidden in the building. It was the pressure of so many ordinary school days laid over each other that, in the right weather and the right quiet, you could feel the layers shifting. A few months after demolition, Denise, who had been on stage that night in 8th grade, found me through my mother and called to ask whether I remembered the clapping thing. She was laughing when she said it, but not dismissively. I thought about it at the open house, she told me, when everybody was in there acting like the place was just sweet. I asked if she still thought we heard a voice. She said, after a pause, "I think schools are full of people trying to start again." That was such a Denise answer that I wrote it down. Maybe that is all it was. Maybe the reading I heard behind the resource room door was air and chairs and rain. Maybe the line in the gym was reflection and tiredness and a child waiting too long for pickup. Maybe the applause was stage acoustics and storm pressure. A reasonable person can build each of those explanations without lying. But what no explanation changes is the feeling of returning as an adult and finding that the building still knew how to become a school more fully than the district paperwork admitted. These days, when people talk about their childhood schools, they often flatten them into one emotion: safe or cruel, beloved or boring, good teachers or bad food. That has never seemed honest to me. Schools are some of the first places where children learn that love and fear can occupy the same hallway without canceling each other. You can be comforted there and frightened there in the same week. You can wait all afternoon for a parent to arrive and love the teacher who waits with you, while also fearing the empty room across the hall, where something seems to keep reading after class has ended. That was Belterre for me. A place of multiplication tables, field days, stomach aches, choir practice, wet sneakers, school plays, sharpened pencils, the first real humiliation of being called on when you do not know the answer, and, woven through all of it, a handful of quiet moments when the building seemed older than the day it was currently holding. The last time I went near the old site, the new school was already open, and the old grounds had been leveled into bare dirt and fencing. Grass was beginning to come back around the edges. The live oaks remained, because they were harder to argue with. The drainage ditch still ran behind the lot, full and green as ever. I parked for a minute on the shoulder and looked through the fence. Nothing was there, of course. No brick wing, no gym, no resource room. Only the idea of them in my head, set against heat shimmer and fresh construction. And yet, from somewhere beyond the new building, I heard what sounded very much like children reading together. It was daytime. It was probably a summer program in session, or a teacher leading a group, or simply the mind's mean little talent for placing old sound on new air. I know all that. Still, I stayed in the car and listened until the voices thinned into insects and distance. That may be the closest I can come to the truth of it. Not that my childhood school was haunted in any clean storybook sense. Not that I solved what happened there by returning, and not even that the scariest stories were the ones with the clearest supernatural shape. The scariest stories were the ones that taught me how thin the line can be between memory and atmosphere, between routine and everyday. If you've ever gone back to a school after a long time away, you may know what I mean. The halls are smaller. The clocks seem lower on the wall. The smell is the same. And somewhere under all the adult explanations you've built since leaving, there is still the child who knew that after the buses pulled away and the rain came on, some parts of a school did not stop being school, simply because I'm only old enough now to tell them more gently. So if you ask what scared me most when I went back to Belterre, it was not seeing something impossible in a window, or hearing one clear voice from an empty row of seats, though both of those have stayed with me. It was understanding, finally, that the building had never belonged only to my version of childhood. It had held too many children, too many days, too many repetitions of waiting, reciting, lining up, performing, listening, hoping to be called, hoping not to be. And on the right quiet afternoons, with rain moving in from the Gulf and the halls emptied of adults, all of that old school life could rise just enough to be felt again. Not enough to prove anything. Only enough to make you stand still in the doorway and listen and remember how it felt when every room was larger than your courage, and every sound after dismissal seemed to come from a part of the day that had not yet agreed to end.